Hello, my friends. Welcome once again to Kardec Radio. You are watching us on Spiritism, a closer look. Luiz Lima here, broadcasting from Orlando, Florida. And we have our program every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Tonight, we are going to take a closer look at a Spiritist view on the Crusades. Crusades are, this significant, to say the minimum, set of events in history that had, uh, a lot of wars and a lot of bad things happened, but also some good things came out of it, believe it or not. So we have, because it wasn't a historical event, we have to take a quick look at some historical facts. So to begin with, the Crusades. What exactly were they? They were a series, not one, they were a series of religious wars involving the Christian church during the medieval period, and it spans for about 200 years, starting in 1095, 1096. So 200 years of ongoing war, on and off, religious wars. Uh, why? Right? So at the time, around the like 1050 year 1050 or so, Jerusalem was, and still is, by the way, a place of considerable importance for the Christians. This place that had a meaning, a true meaning for the Christian community. So it was a place that was visited by, especially by Catholics, and they would just go to Jerusalem, for visiting, to know the place. And then many of them, by the way, would go there to relive the Passion of Christ. So it had that much weight on the Catholic community. Jerusalem at the time was dominated mostly by Arabs. So the bulk of the population were by Arabs from Baghdad and Egypt. So everything, the tourists would come in and out, no problem. But then in the year 1073, Jerusalem fell into the hands of the Turks. So the Turks, seized the city and started controlling the city. And with time, the Turks no longer welcomed those Christians and tourists, and they threw them out of the city. So they would say, the Turks would say, you're Christian, you're a tourist here, you're not welcome. Go, get out, which is, not nice. So the Christian faith, led by the Pope, the Pope was, ahead of the Christian church. That's what a Pope is, the one ahead of the Christian church. So in the year 1096, the Pope at the time, Urban II, he got really mad about the situation. So he calls for a crusade to seize Jerusalem and eliminate the Turks present in the area. That was the initial proposal. So there's other things, we're not going to go deep in history because it's not really what we need to do here today. So it's just some historical highlights. That's all it is before we get into the spirit view. So he was able to convince a lot of people, and they were able to gather an army of 500,000 men. These men, they met in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul in Turkey, and on their way towards Jerusalem, they conquered other cities like Nicaea, Antioch. There were important cities as well. So they conquered all of those, and they finally made their way into Jerusalem by 1099. So at the year 1099, these crusaders had conquered Jerusalem, took it away from the Turks. Of course, the Turks didn't like it, and they're gonna come back. on, and that's why the war is on and off all the time. So anyhow, so the Turks got uh, expelled from Jerusalem, and now Jerusalem is going to be controlled by Christians, by Catholics mostly, and the church is behind them all the way. Well, the Turks didn't like the idea. They fought back to reconquer Jerusalem. So they were, before they could get to Jerusalem, they were conquering smaller cities around Jerusalem. So on the year 1145, the Pope at the time, Eugene III, he organizes a second crusade to take these other cities away from the Turks, because the Turks were approaching, conquering city by city. So the Pope said, no, we need to win these cities back because they can't be close to Jerusalem. That was the goal. So this second crusade was led by uh, uh, Louis VII and Conrad III, and it wasn't successful. They were not able to defeat the Turks. The Turks stood still, and they were able to hold their possessions or their dominance over certain areas and cities. So in the year 1189, so you see, we're almost 100 years into this thing. In the year 1189, I'm sorry, the Third Crusade was put together. This is also called the Crusades of the Kings, and the reason is the kings of the West, the Christian kings of the West, decided to, take this thing on their own control instead of letting the Pope do it. So they did it themselves. That's why it's called the Third Crusade, the Crusade of the Kings. So the problem is Jerusalem by then had fallen into the hands of a guy called Saladin. He was a sultan of both Egypt and Syria, so he was able to conquer Jerusalem. And the Third Crusade had the objective of take Jerusalem back, take it away from Saladin. So they went in the Third Crusade to fight for Jerusalem. They were able to conquer, a few places, a few cities, and in a way, it was kind of successful. However, the Turks and Saladin, they don't let go easy. So the church created a fourth crusade in 1202. This fourth crusade was led by Louis IX, called the Holy King of France. Why did he have his name? Well, Holy King of France. King of France because he was the king. So he had this political control, economical, social control over the population. He was the king. And holy because he was this devoted Catholic that was, as he was reigning over France, he would express his faith in Jesus, and as a Catholic member of the church, he would just, make this visible to the population. So he was known as the Holy King of France. Later on, when he discarnates, he takes the name that Allan Kardec calls Saint Louis. Anyway, which is, it's a spirit by then discarnate by the time the codification came about. And he was very influential in terms of a spirit bringing messages, telling us what to do, guiding Allan Kardec and all of the other spirits. So he had this major participation in the codification later on in 1857. Anyhow, he as a king, he made significant changes to the legal system in France for a better society, more justice. So he had all this whole of a good king and this good Christian. But he was the one in charge of the crusade. So, finally, This is the fourth crusade, and apparently things were going to get a little bit more settled after the fourth crusade, at least between Christians and Muslims, or Christians and Turks. Okay, so there are more crusades considered by historians, but those are crusades. They are called crusades because of the type of activity, but they were internal crusades, Christians against Christians and stuff like that. That's not the purpose here today. We wanted to talk about the first four crusades, what we call the original crusades. So, a few interesting consequences, a few interesting facts that we're going to pull out from this. First, the Crusades. By the way, what I'm going to say about the spiritual part, the spiritual view of the Crusades, is in this book here, On the Way to the Light, written by, dictated by Spirit Emmanuel. He uses one phrase, one interesting phrase here. He says, the Crusades had this anti-Christian quality because there's absolutely nothing Christian in it. Going after people, killing people, massive amount of people being killed. When did Jesus ever mention something like this? Never. If you go to any gospel, any translation of any time, you're not going to find any of this thing, any recommendation by Jesus that, we should one day, maybe if this happens, you should proceed this way. Never, ever, ever. And more interestingly is the whole thing started by a pope, Pope Urban II in 1095, 1096. So it's like, how come, right? Everything is wrong. It started all wrong. So Spirit Emmanuel tells us that the Crusades had this anti-Christian quality. Now, many of the people who participated directly or not in these crusades, they would later on start to kind of rethink or reevaluate the presence of a military Jesus in their lives. Because this is a military Jesus that we are presenting to the Islamic population or the Turks or whoever it is. And there is no such a thing in any gospel. Jesus never said anything like this. These crusades left to a lot of destruction, a lot of devastation in places and cities, and these wars continue to the east. And at one point, they started depleting nature from its landscaping because so many wars, so many destruction, it started to have an impact in the environment, on the environment. So the whole thing was a disaster. Now, however, on the other hand, this thing weakened the power, the tyranny of these feudal lords. All right, because these guys, they had all the power because they own land, massive amounts of land. And, after the Crusades, they were kind of not regarded as so much powerful as we initially thought. So they start to lose their ability to impose their power on people. And one of the things that came out of it is it was brought, the discussion about resolving the problem of ownership of land was brought back to the population because there were small conflicts here and there, people fighting for land. This land is mine, this piece is mine, get out of here because I got here first, that kind of thing. So feudalism came to an end because of that. These lords, these feudal owners of land, they lost control. And then something else is going to start, a new approach to how we are going to live in a different society. Because if something is going away, the feudalism is going away, things are going to change. How are we going to perceive our upcoming new society or societies in Europe? That's an interesting point. So the royal system of government becomes a model, like the monarchies. And so England proposes and actually writes the Magna Carta, which we can, without going into many details, we could consider this to be the first constitution ever in the world. It contains the core of how a modern society should be organized, and it will impose a natural uh, um, organization on the society because of that Magna Carta, which was something we didn't see for centuries until by the time the Roman Empire got destroyed in 476. That kind of thing, the organized society, we didn't have it anymore. So this is now going to come back, and we are in the year like 1150, 1200, somewhere around that time. So we felt the need to have a better society, more organized, with decent laws that would express what that society was looking for. And the Magna Carta is the first of all, which is going to later on, it's going to be at the base for most of the constitutions around the world. Another thing that came out of the Crusades is the East and the West of the old Roman Empire. They were not really friends to each other. They had this distance between them, and that came to an end too. Instead of a separation, cooperation starts to take place. Instead of competition, cooperation, collaboration starts to take place, and make these two halves of the old Roman Empire get closer to each other, have better integration, learn more about each other. So by then, we can say that the Crusades, as a consequence, it influenced Europe to work on its regeneration. And that's exactly what started to happen. Each region in Europe started to organize their own political units, their society with their set of laws and all of that. So Europe enters a new phase, and that new phase there's a lot of transformation here because there's a lot of changes. But those changes go until the year 1453, when Constantinople is taken by the Ottoman Empire, and that's the end of, at least historically speaking, it's the end of the medieval period. Now, all of these things could not take place without the spirits in the spiritual realm being attent to it. They had to oversee everything. You see, it's hard for Europe, for example, to reestablish itself as a society. It's hard because there are no resources, there's no education. The level of literacy is less than 10%, between 5 and 10%. So the intellectuality is not there at the level that we know today. So it's very hard to do this turnaround. The organization of the societies prior to this had always taken place in the shadows of the church. The church was on top of everything. You would say yes or no to everything. And the church had no interest no interest whatsoever in sustaining and spreading education. Because, More education means there you can open the possibilities for different interpretations of life, the Gospels, and everything else. And we don't want that. We, the church at the time, we don't want that. So they had everything under strict control for such a long time. The schools at the time were limited to monasteries, so they were biased schools, and we had theology dominating over other things such as philosophy, science, medicine, arts. So theology was dominating over everything. It was the only thing important to learn according to the church and under their terms. So the church prohibited the examination of facts and historical facts, prohibited free opinion. You couldn't have that. Everything is dogmatic. You just shut up. You can't say anything. Don't think. For such a long time. Now, when we look at something that we already talked about here, when you look at the spirit scale, right, let me put the spirit scale here for you. The spirit scale reveals levels of moral advancement of spirits. The lowest level, impure, and the highest level, pure, and anything in between. So the red ones are in the bottom of the scale, the green ones are in the middle of the scale, and the blue ones are at the top of the scale. And on earth, we always had, and we still have, living at the same time, spirits from all these different levels, I would say. So we have today, for example, we have spirits that are frivolous, impure, benevolent, wise. We have all sorts of things. It's a mix. That's what make the lower level spirits advance, by learning from those who are more advanced. So they have to be living in the same place. So when you look at this, these crusaders and those who organized these crusades, they were at the bottom of the scale. They were these red spirits. They were, they wouldn't care for saving lives or people living their lives. No, they wanted the power. They wanted the, impose their wishes, and that's it. So this is all happening. And in our higher realms, spirit world, the reconstruction of all societies and the foundation of a new world is being thought through. How are we going to help these incarnate spirits to come out of the mess they are and start to, be go up on the spirit scale? How are we going to do this? And it comes through two things: inspiration first and reincarnation. Let me explain this to you. Inspiration will lead to the creation of the great universities, the Paris universities, Bologna, Coimbra in Portugal, Salamanca, Oxford, all of these things. Also, by inspiration, things that were not visible to the society. Again, theology dominates over everything, over medicine, law, arts, architecture, language, everything. Nothing was visible, just theology. So, through inspiration, the higher realm is able to uh, attempt to make an attempt to rebirth intellectuality. And that comes on board through one movement called the Renaissance. That's what the Renaissance is for. So the Renaissance comes through new architecture, new a different face in the arts, language. Each of these smaller societies are going to establish their own language with their own methods of speaking and so. So this is one thing, inspiration. The second thing that I said is reincarnation. Europe is going to have new generations after all of this. The new generations were organized by the higher realm. How? For example, Portugal and Spain. The spirits that will incarnate as of that point in Portugal and Spain are the old Phoenicians. And why? The Phoenicians had this predilection for the sea. They were sea people, if you will. And Portugal and Spain led the great navigations. France receives or has the old Athenian spirits will be born in France now. These Athenians, the Greek, bring the philosophy to dethrone theology, and that's going to happen through the Age of Enlightenment in 1750 or 1700. So these were the old Greek Athenians that reincarnated. The ones for Prussia or the German world, gets those who were the old Sparta spirits. They were more like driven to war and had this education, this idea that they should be the best language. So that led to what we call the pan-Germanism, which is the political unification of the German language speakers. So all of these things were orchestrated in the spiritual realm. And we have, for example, Joan of Arc in the 1400s, and she's this spirit coming and seeking for justice and fraternity, trying to show people, we've had bad days, we had a bad time, with the Crusades and all these holy wars. It's time to stop this thing. So when you put this all together, I'm just going to say three things that if we can extract everything in like 1 minute. The Crusades were called by the popes. Popes are those who are ahead of the Christian church, supposed to be doing the best for Christianity. Passing along the message of Christ, teaching the best. However, in those days, the popes were the one calling the Crusades. This does not happen anymore. That's 1,000 years in the past. So we got better. Yes, we did. I'm not saying it was easy, but we got better. So we can see that the Crusades, in a way, in several ways, and I spoke of some of them, they were a necessary evil that would be this, like the spirits pushing us to, hey, people, come on, let's go ahead and get better, improve your moral standards. So that was also something that we can take away from the Crusades. And finally, I would say the necessity to leave theology at a second plan and bring something more rational philosophy that's going to then dominate to the point that the church loses its dominance altogether in around 1850, but that's a different story. So all of this was all these movements, these pieces moving around took place because we had this necessary evil called the Crusades. I really recommend you to read this, On the Way to the Light by Spirit Emmanuel. There's an entire chapter about the Crusades, the Spiritist view on the Crusades. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And again, we do this every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be here next week. Thanks so much.